Um, Andy Street, what is it that mayors are doing that wasn't being done before?
They're thinking on a regional basis and delivering stuff that frankly hasn't happened for 30 years. So a huge investment in transport can only be done at a regional basis. Transport systems don't stop at the end of one local authority. Planning the skills system for a region doesn't just stop at the end of one local authority. The market is region wide. And then, so it's all about doing only those things that are best done at regional level.
But the nascent English devolution settlement that we're seeing is dissimilar to devolution as it's understood in the nations, because it's mainly urban. Each of the settlements is different. The terms around the power of each job is evolving. What do you see the next decade looking like for the job of a mayor?
So you're right. They have all the mayoralties have come together in different ways at different times, but the fundamental principle is the same. It's about having one single person accountable who understands the local issues and through the structures, and they're different in different places as well, actually delivers for people on the ground. And the principle is that you take the decision nearest the source of the scene of the action. So in terms of going forward, I'm a believer that three things will happen. Number one, we will move to a more standard model across the country. This idea of a sort of patchwork and different things will move on, but it was absolutely a fine way to get it started. Secondarily, we will actually move to greater powers, but not unlimited powers, choosing the areas where people really can make a difference. And thirdly, there will need to be a financial settlement so that we actually have sustainable finances in these areas and we end the sort of begging bowl culture to central London.
And what do you think the settlement will look like for rural England? Because obviously this only affects mainly urban England at the moment.
Yes.
How does the government, come up with a structure which can actually handle country towns and villages?
Well, there's still an identity through counties, so it could be a strengthening of the county council system. And if you look at large, proud counties, basic model will have to be building on the county councils, which are large areas with a real geographical identity, often based around one large town or indeed city. And I think that's the model going forward. And whether or not it's a directly elected mayor or it's an enhancement of those counties, the principle is still that more will need to be done locally rather than in central London.
And there's an expectation, isn't there, that levelling up is now the domestic economic policy of the major parties. What are the levers of powers that would be needed by mayors to make that a truly transformational agenda?
Well, there's something deeply ironic here, isn't there? That everyone says levelling up is the new sort of zeitgeist jargon, but actually what this whole job was about, the idea of devolution in David Cameron's government was about levelling up. It might not have been described as that then, it was probably described as the rebalancing of the economy, but it came to the same thing, trying to have less dependence on London and actually trying to enable the other big city regions of the country to fully fulfill their opportunity. That's the idea that's been there for 10, 11 years. And I always say slightly cheekily, the West Midlands before the pandemic was actually already doing levelling up. So what do I mean by that? It wasn't about building a bridge or building a bypass. It was actually about outcomes. And the outcomes were that we were closing the gap to the national economic performance. And most importantly, we were providing opportunities for our young people. So the single biggest lever around levelling up is the whole question of skills and qualifications for our workforce, and then making sure that we have the good businesses here who will give people those career opportunities. That's ultimately how we know it's happening. And the one statistic, if you really wanted to push me on what I want to see change, is those measures of social mobility that say that actually a child born in Wolverhampton has the same chance of achieving more in life as a child born in London.
Fraser, over to you.
So, Andy, you're a very passionate advocate for what mayors have been able to get on and do in the few years that they've been established. And it's clear that you think there's a lot more that they could do and a lot more that could be done to strengthen the role of regional mayors and other forms of English devolution. Do you get a sense, though, that the government is still fully behind this agenda? We were expecting a white paper that was going to set out the next wave of devolution. Do you think that there's been a little bit of attention disappearing in central government, perhaps a lack of ambition about what this programme could really achieve?
There's been a pause, would probably be my best word for it. And that's understandable, given that the Prime Minister had to face Brexit and had to face the pandemic. It's no surprise that this has been slightly slower agenda. But what I'm very confident of is when the government think about how we're going to deal with the challenges post-pandemic, you will come to the inevitable conclusion that the regions of England have to perform better than they have been performing long term. And then you will come to the inevitable question about how is that going to be driven, and this idea of regional strategic plans. That's what this is really all about. What's the best for the West Midlands? What's the best for Greater Manchester? What's the best for the North East? And then having an individual and institutions and power and cash to make that happen. There's an inescapable logic about that. And that's why I do believe all the talk about levelling up will coalesce with the talk around devolution, even though one's fashionable and one, I accept your argument, is not so fashionable.
And you talk about COVID and Brexit and that having a natural impact on everything that government's been doing. But actually, COVID in particular has elevated the national profile of a number of mayors across England. How have you found the ways of working that have built up, presumably quite organically, between you? How do you work together where you've got common interests and obviously compete where you want to be attracting investment or attention to your region? How have you found that relationship with that cohort of mayors?
Yeah, well, interesting question, Fraser, because of course, as in any competition, you have to see it at two levels. Of course, we compete with, I don't know, let's say Manchester, the great old-fashioned rivalry, Birmingham-Manchester. Of course, you compete for individual investment, but underneath it, there's a much bigger point, which is that for the UK to thrive, Birmingham and Manchester and Leeds as the second, third, fourth economies all have to do well. And that's the bit that we didn't do well over time. So actually, there is a huge amount that binds the mayors cross-party together with this idea that we need to build this sort of capability in each of our big regions. And if you look at the UK compared to France, Germany, the US, arguably more successful economies, one of the big differences is the degree of centralization. And this point about balancing that is what's driven me, and I also believe drives other mayors. So actually, we work collaboratively on that principle, even if what's actually going to make one region famous and successful is different to what's going to make another region famous and successful.
And just finally, on identity, we talk quite often when we're talking to politicians and thinkers from Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland about how devolution, legislative devolution, having a new parliament has changed the nature of the way things work in those parts of the UK. Obviously, regional devolution in England is different, but have you noticed a change in how the West Midlands thinks about itself following the creation of your position as mayor? Do you think that it's had any impact on the way that the West Midlands sees itself?
I think it had a critical impact, maybe not quite as you're implying, but the big impact is actually for us to understand that we have to work together as a region, cross-party, with all the other institutions of leadership, whether they be the health service, education providers, or indeed business, for the good of the region together. And I do think the combined authority and the mayor as an individual has been the glue for that. And if I look at the decade 2000 to 2010, this region didn't work particularly effectively together. If I look at the last few years, we have demonstrably worked better together, and it has led to a better relative performance. So actually, I think having some institutional capability at the heart of the region has brought people together and actually has made us much more attractive, whether it be to government for investment, because there's a trust in what we're going to do, or of course, critically, and most critically going forward, to the private sector, who can see the way the place is led and assembled.
Just a final one from me, because then we've got 5 quick fire questions for you. Do you think that Whitehall has to recast itself to deal with the new structures of mayors? Because it hasn't really adapted, has it? You know, the contact department is communities, but obviously there is a wider impact. You will talk to people across many different departments. You know, has Whitehall caught up with the 13 or so mayors across England?
I actually have great sympathy for Whitehall trying to deal with this patchwork as we described it as earlier. So I think it would help Whitehall hugely if there was a more standard approach, actually. I also think, and they are beginning to do this, I do think Whitehall embedded in regions is really important. So the relocation of some departments, and it's very important. That's not just the back office. It needs to be the sort of brains of a department. So senior thinkers, ministers, as we're going to see with the MHCLG coming to Wolverhampton. But there's also a piece just about all the bilateral siloed arrangements that we have to have. And I think the next step for Whitehall will be some form of, it's easy to say, it's evaded them for years and years, but for us, it'd be so much easier. If we want a single pot of financial investment, we almost should have a single pot of who we are accountable to as our sort of monitor, partner, thinker, co-conspirator, you might almost say, within Whitehall. And that would make it so much more straightforward than all of this bilateral management.
Okay, all right. Quick fire questions. Fraser will do the first two, and then I'll finish off.
Yeah. So the first one: British English or Brummie?
Oh, I know the answer to that. Brummie. And the reason I know the answer to that is I watched the England game last night. Obviously, incredibly sad the outcome, and we all felt an incredible passion. But I sat there thinking, if Aston Villa were playing, would I be more excited about that? And the answer is yes.
Your proudest moment as mayor?
Proudest moment as mayor? I suppose it was, there isn't one moment, I'll give you one moment in a minute, but it's not about a one thing, actually. It's much more about a psychology, and that's this place believes it can win again. For years, we lost every competition we entered. In those good years before the pandemic, we won nearly all the competitions we entered, City of Culture, Commonwealth Games, 5G. I guess one thing was in that school in Perry Bar on the morning that it was announced that Birmingham would host the Commonwealth Games, which will be next year. The kids were so, so proud.
All the mayors will come to the UK for COP26 this year. Who's the most impressive mayor?
Worldwide? Well, you probably would have to say Anne Hidalgo is amongst them, actually. I think on that agenda, you would probably naturally think to her. And I suppose what I really admire about her is that she's got some radical policies I might not agree with, but she's actually had the confidence to plough her own trough. And actually, she's done it in a reasonable degree of collaboration with the French government as well.
An English Parliament, would it make any difference at all?
No difference at all. Another complication to the system. Should be quite possible for Westminster to organise itself around that. And I actually think the whole notion of regional identity and then a UK identity in Britain, in England, is the appropriate way through this.
And final one thing you would want people who aren't familiar with the West Midlands to know?
Who aren't familiar with the West Midlands to know? Oh my goodness, that's the hardest question of all so far. that they're not likely to know. I think probably that I'd want them to know about the Lunar Society, actually. Now, this might sound an academic answer, but this was a group of 18th century industrialists who changed the world economically. So they were looking at steam engines, great technological breakthroughs, but they were thinking about how these brought social breakthroughs as well. And this group, the Lunar Society, was a sort of group who thought about enlightenment. And I'd want people to think, yeah, that was a place in the 18th century where economic progress and social progress was thought about hand in hand.
Andy, thank you very much. Fascinating.